My purpose was always to help develop others. I think the one thing that has resonated with me in that way of like having a contribution is just being mindful and creating the environments in which you listen to the development of others and you create opportunities for their development. I think that a lot of times I don't feel like I give a student like the answer, but I often create the situation in which they can ask their own question. I just realized that I've actually been a scientist all along. I just didn't know that the scientists were doing the same thing as really good artists do. I think curiosity, asking questions, pushing people was really something of interest.
Welcome to the Science with Impact podcast. Why should they tune into this conversation?
I would say that we are all going through a process and understanding our role as scientists and how we interact with the systems around us. And I would just say that you're not alone. One thing that I've appreciated about many of the discussions that I've heard, that so many things resonated and made me feel like sometimes it was like the realization of something I was thinking about that somebody captured so well in the way they structured their understanding. And then sometimes it was just hearing my story in them. So I would just say that you're not alone. Give yourself permission to have these complicated, difficult discussions, whether everything's going great and you just need to just be mindful of what you're going through, or you're having a difficult time thinking about other ways that you can see the situation or the system that you're connected with. I'm Cesar Nufio, and I work at Biointeractive currently, which is at HHMI or Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Content developer. I develop online activities, films to help develop animations and things like that to support the classroom. I got my degree at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And I think the other thing to know about me is probably that I came to this country when I was about 6 years old. So I'm an immigrant to this country. I'm very proud of my Latino and Guatemalan heritage.
I'm so glad that you're here and sharing your story here geographically and digitally. Could you explain a little bit more to the audience how you know me?
We met at the 2025. It was the Lipton Poudry Leadership Institute. And you had you came back because I had done the Institute in 2021. And I came back to help your group think about designing and organizing your leadership plan for the next 5 to 10 years. It's good to have reflections of people who have done it to say, when I write this, what should I be mindful of? And how does this change in the future and things like that? So we had a great discussion.
The first question I love to ask the scientists who come in and speak with us is, everybody seems to have such a different story about the moments that led to them realizing that they could be a scientist and that they want to become a scientist. Can you share any of those highlights, those standout moments that happened to you?
I was in high school. I had bad science classes. I did not want to be a scientist. I was just not interested. When I went to college, I was an art student. And I would hang out with like the philosophy majors and the history majors, and we would stay up all night asking questions about like, why are we here? And why are people the way they are? And what's good and bad? And all of those different things. And at the end of the night, it just felt like a little discouraging because it was always like, well, it's relative. We'll never know. And I just felt like, God, there's got to be something else there. So I took a intro to psychobiology course. And in that course, I remember learning, I was like a sponge in that course, and I never expected myself to. But we learned things like, if there's different parts of the brain that are damaged, it affects people in different ways. And that's how we know the functions of the brain. And then we started talking about neurotransmitters and this new idea that chemistry was behind the way we feel and the way we understand our emotions. I had never seen that world. I remember we did an experiment to understand that actually we don't see color on our periphery, but our brain fills that in. It just says that was green and I'm going to keep it green. And so we had to do these balls of different color. And then we realized that we can't actually see those balls of different color until we look at it in front of us. It's like, yeah, it's yellow because it's like your brain's doing something. And I just remember all of a sudden, science was asking those questions that I was really curious about. Why are we the way that we are? And why do we think the way that we think? And then there were a couple of books that we were supposed to read. And one of the books was The Selfish Gene. And it's this idea that really we as humans, plants, fish, all of these different animals are really just vehicles that are here to propagate genes. And really, it's the genes that are going to be living on. We're not that important. It's very sci-fi, but for some reason it captured my mind and I started to think about evolution. And I think that sitting in that classroom just changed my world about how I understood science to be. And then it actually really was very relevant to my life. So I'm not sure I felt like I'm going to be a scientist, but I felt like I love science. And so that's probably my big introduction to science.
That's so wonderful and unfortunate that it took until college for you to get that exposure of the curiosity of science. You know, when you're looking back on that, you've taught college level science courses. Looking back on that experience, how has that informed your teaching and the way that you create media today?
Right. So I think that's a really good question. Oftentimes I think that when we have content, or like, I'm going to teach you how this plant does this, or I'm going to teach you these types of things. But oftentimes we are not very aware of all of the students that are in our space. They just get a one-dimensional idea of science. And I think that that's what I got in high school. I think I was fortunate to come into that classroom and then click and say, oh my gosh, all of these esoteric questions I was asking make sense in this classroom. But oftentimes there's a lot of students that are like in college or coming into these classes that we teach, they value different things, whether it's like, what is the role of science in society or different questions that they have. So I think the way that it's informed me is that I tend to be more mindful of students bringing in their own questions and guiding their own understanding. So like, what do you want to know about? Like, this is a class about ecology, but like, how is ecology relevant to your life? And what do you hope that this class represents? So when I did teach ecology, I would have students write a first essay that was like, if ecology connects with you, what would this class be? I was floored by so many different perspectives. And then at the end, I would have students just write the reflection of like, what did ecology mean to you? And how did it help you change your own perspectives and ideas? Or how did it not achieve what you had hoped? And I found some really, really cool things that just floored me that I had no idea.
The value of asking our students, what do you want to get out of this? Because we so often, between our learning objectives and like ACS testing standards and things like that, we have a very clear idea of what we want to teach them. But like you said, almost no idea of what it is that they want to learn. And so what a really cool metacognitive exercise that you had your students do. It sounds like the big difference between perceiving science in high school and then at the college level for you was the appealing to your curiosity and maybe even satisfying more of your curiosity. Does that resonate with you?
The funny thing is that I remember seeing a show and somebody had made a controversial painting of Jesus and people were upset. It got me to wonder, why are people upset? And I just love the idea that people that were artists got people to think, got people to be curious. And that's why I was an art student until I was a junior, because I thought that's what you did there. And then I think the more I learned about science, the more I went, oh, they're asking questions there too. They're pursuing their curiosity and making people think. I just realized that I've actually been a scientist all along. I just didn't know that the scientists were doing the same thing as really good artists do. I think curiosity, asking questions, pushing people was really something of interest. I remember reading this one paper by a scientist, and all of these scientists were opposed to. And I just loved that they were opposed to. It just made you think, like, why? It made you reflect on that. I think both making you think and curiosity are really central to resonate with me as why being a scientist is so.
I have conversations with my husband, who's a recording artist, a lot about the overlap between art and science and how strong that overlap is. And I guess one of them that I'm hearing in our conversation is that good art and science makes you feel something, even if that feeling is often curiosity or even anger, it makes you feel something. And it gives you, once you feel something, I hope you can't help but explore it. Why do I feel that way? Why do I think that way? What assumptions am I making? And that sounds so much like critical art inquiry as well as like the scientific
Yes.
method.
I think that when we do science, there's this idea that, okay, get emotion out of it because it's about a p-value and it's about an argument. It's about all of these things. And we fear that if we're emotional, that we're removing certain components that give us legitimacy, this objective legitimacy. But I do think it's central to why we're actually doing this to begin with. Why did I become an ecologist and pursue those types of questions? Why do I love grasshoppers? I mean, there's this insect that's just squishy. It spits and things. And I think their emotions are super important and they fill us with joy and surprise and they motivate us. And I think oftentimes we lose track of that as scientists. So I'm glad you mentioned it because it is curiosity, but curiosity is an objective term. It's like we are trying to find that answer, right? But really, there's an emotional component to that curiosity. Want to be excited to know more and things like that.
How different is curiosity from wonder when you really think about it? I guess wonder has more of a magical vibe to the word, but really at their essence, they both mean like, what is this? What is the meaning of this thing?
I found that I have now an efficiency for thinking about something. So when we might be creating an activity about climate change or about addiction or something like that, I have this like, okay, first, here's the conceptual framework. Then this is the leading questions. I just have this great efficiency, scientific efficiency. And I think it's the way that we've learned to communicate and to share ideas. And then I go and I talk to filmmakers. They take what we do and the concepts, like we were making a climate change movie. I'm going to find an emotional in between the world and science. I'm going to highlight people in different parts of their career. And it was like this other layer that made the science that's kind of cool that was enjoyable to watch and not a lesson to be given. So I do think that working with teachers, working with artists, I got to trust them because here's my idea, but you go with it because I've got this scientific reductionist lack of emotional context. But I think that other dimension is super critical.
I'm so captivated by this idea of this space that you navigate as a scientist and a science communicator and a storyteller. Most of our audience are research scientists looking to broaden their societal impacts. Are there any tips or reflections that you've experienced as very valuable when navigating that transition for this is what I want to teach to this is the story I want to tell?
Sometimes knowing your audience is really critical. And I work with teachers all the time. And I think one thing that you really have to do is listen. Like, what is that classroom like? What are the things that you want to do in the classroom? What are the limitations? I think understanding our different audiences, like sometimes we go, oh, I'm going to go talk to a youth group. And then it's like our own mind about what this youth group is and what it's composed of and what is their values. And we're like generations apart. So do we really know what they want? But I think that listening is a really important component of being more effective at communicating with different audiences. I've just had so many students that I worked with who have looked at data or looked at relationships so different than the narrative that I gave them. That was super insightful. In our space, when we communicate, we should be mindful about how we communicate, the jargon we use. I always told teachers, you have to talk to the students. If I use any big words or if I use any ideas, like it just slips, right? Just like I'm not mindful. And I say phenology. And I ask the teacher to just raise their hand and say, you used a word. What was that? And it's not really because I want to use big words that they want to understand. It's just that sometimes I'm not completely aware of the types of needs that are there. So I do think that being mindful of your audience is important and coming back. So it's not just like, oh, I'm just going to be there and I'm going to listen to you, reflect on what was it like with that group and talk to them. What were the things that they valued and how can my approach be different next time that I interact with this particular group? I think listening is probably the thing that I've learned the most to do because I'm not as smart as I thought I was, and I'm not as effective at communicating. And all of these things are practice, and our practice requires more. So if we're always going to get better, we need to figure out ways to learn.
What is one thing that you think you've really done that reaches people who would want to become a scientist someday, like really had an impact on somebody outside of like an academic context?
One value that I've always had, and I think it's because my own growing up, we didn't have very much. And I think my own cultural upbringing, it was the church pastor that took us to Six Flags because our parents were working. There would be teacher day and my mom would give us flowers to give to the teacher. And I think there was always a value for helping other people. And I remember one time in intro bio class, I saw this one video, and the video showed water going from the ground through a plant and then up in the air. And they were talking about these bonds that these water molecules were having that were light bonds. They weren't totally covalent bonds, but they were enough of a bond that each one of them took the other one. And for some reason, that totally resonated with me, with the feeling of like what my purpose was. My purpose was always to help develop others. So when we talk about leadership and we talk about like, what do leaders do? I really resonate with the idea that we're here to develop others because that's why I'm here. I think the one thing that has resonated with me in that way of like having a contribution is just being mindful and creating the environments in which you listen to the development of others and you create opportunities for their development. I think that a lot of times I don't feel like I give a student like the answer, but I often create the situation in which they can ask their own questions and come to their own conclusions about things. And I think sometimes you just need that space. And I have seen people that I worked with, like there was a student I'm thinking about who was like a C student, and they just were a bit lost. And then when they were working in my lab, they just wanted to do things like, well, I could wash the dishes. And I'm like, well, no, those are my dishes. I'm going to do that. But it's like, what are you interested in? What do you want to do? And they had never had anybody ask them those types of things. And then I remember being in the field one day and we were having lunch and he just stood up and then he said, I get it. And I don't know exactly everything that he got, but he just said, I get it. And then he's like, I'm going to get a master's. And I was just like, whoa, like, I don't know what it was, but we talked about it. And then he was like talking about how he understood all these different concepts that we had been talking about. And we had been going to all these different field sites. And now he sort of made these huge connections. But somehow that excited him enough to say, this is also part of my journey, my next steps. And then I had a student one time who said that they were interested in being a scientist, but they're not going to do it because scientists don't believe in God. And I was like, oh, can we talk about this? Let's just talk about it. And then I'm like, well, maybe there are a lot of scientists that don't believe in God, but their values come from somewhere and they value these different things. Your values come from your beliefs. And we talked about that. I honored that different perspective. And they went on to study genetics. So I feel like the one-on-one mentorship, listening, just investing in individuals has been what I'm most proud of. Sometimes I would get down just because I was in a transitory position, soft money. And then students would write me thank yous. They would say, thank you for writing me a letter for this. Thank you for helping me apply to this internship. I had that envelope and this drawer. I would just throw them in there. Each one of them meant something at that moment, but then I would just put them there to save them. And then when I was leaving academia and I was going to my next job at the National Science Foundation, I was cleaning up and then all of these they were crawling. They just came out and I cried because I was just like, wow, like this was important. Like I did important things when I was here. And my important things was not, I published this many papers or I get this much citations, but I impacted all of these people. And so much that they wrote a thank you because it was meaningful to their own journey.
It must have been really challenging to open that box as you were transitioning from one role to another. Was it hard to leave after you found that box again?
I was ready for the next stage of our journey. It just reminded me of my impact on this part of the journey. As you're moving, you go, yeah, I did some good. And these cards reflect the good that I.
Also, that supports that you were making the right choice for you. And I think if that created doubt, then that would have been a different choice. You discussed earlier the importance of leadership. And in a previous conversation that we've had, we were really deconstructing the idea of leadership and questioning its underlying assumptions and the power structure of like using the plant analogy. What does it mean to go up? What is implied by that we develop? How can researchers apply a similar deconstruction to rethink the traditional metrics and incentives that we use to define what is academic success and impact?
After I took that leadership course, it really love one aspect of it. And that's that when we are transitioning into different systems, and maybe they're not people like us, or maybe we haven't had training in this, there's a really good component of deconstructing of like, how does this work? Like, how do I succeed? What are the rules? How do I understand these things? And what are different leadership styles? It's really important for us to understand how it works so that we could be successful and navigate it. And then also so we can change it from within, understanding those rules. Now, I think that's what I really believed before I went into it. I just really felt like these rules are in place for a particular reason, right? These are important metrics that define what a leader is and how effective a scientist is, or the number of papers they publish, the number of clients that they get, the number of students they matriculate, what have those types of metrics. And then I think that I started to find myself just not happy. It's weird because like when you would teach classes or when you do outreach or you would do all of these different things, the system would treat it as that's what you do on the side. And then really the number of papers, the type of journal, those are the things that we value. Getting a grant is the things that we value. And I guess my feeling, and I hadn't realized this, is that developing collaborations, all of these other things were things I thought were central to the definition of a scientist because that was me. But the system was saying, no, this is the way leadership and who a person is in science is valued. And I didn't anticipate that disconnect. I went to a mentorship workshop and the person said, a lot of times when we see students, we tend to think that the students are unprepared or they're not ready for something. And they said, but if you have a plant to grow and the plant's not doing well, do you blame the plant or do you think about the environment in which the plant is? Are you giving it enough water? The soil, is it getting enough light? And that was just like, whoa, it resonated with me because I think sometimes what happens is that we're in the system and we don't feel like we could succeed in it. And we don't feel like we share the values that it has, but we believe in it. So there must be something wrong with that. And I think that sometimes deconstructing is really important to reconsider like all of those metrics that people are using to validate what a researcher is. And then think about those are arbitrary in some, they promote privilege, they promote the system, they do all of these things. They're there for a purpose. And that purpose is not necessarily for you and your own success, right? But I think sometimes we reflect on them as if they're given. And I guess what I would say is that when you feel discomfort and you don't feel like something's working out, don't necessarily think there's something wrong with you. Think about the system and its incentives. Sometimes the system is so broken that it's okay to leave the system. And it's not necessarily because you're broken. It's just that your values, your metrics of like, how are you going to be a successful person? How do you achieve those goals that you want to in life are just not being met with the system and the types of rules that are there. So getting out of academia, it's so weird because I just thought that was reality. I worked at NSF and there was not that academic structure. We were all working to fulfill goals that we were sharing. And that was weird, but I loved it. And so I guess what I would just say is that there are alternate things and alternate systems and metrics that actually do exist. We just get so used to the ones that academia gives us that it's hard to see through them at times.
What do you think academia as a system values if we work backwards from the way that we measure success in academia?
The best way we could think what they value is by seeing what are their metrics, right? If you're thinking about a successful scientist, what is that annual review looking like for a professor's? How many things did you publish? What type of journal did you publish in? How many grants did you get? And the other thing is, are you the lead author? Are you the lead on that grant? If we work backwards that way and say, okay, that's what we're assessing, then that should reflect the values, right? And in those values, a lot of times is not mentorship. It's not communicating or interacting with the community. It's not reach. There's a lot of components that are missing from that. It's the things that you write at the bottom that sort of miscellaneous things that I, right. But the weird thing I often saw is I often saw that in academia, there was like this dual mind where you would have the university would sell itself as like important in the community. Your students will have all of this opportunity and all these resources and everything. But all of those values that we give to parents and we give to the purpose of society are not the metrics that we're evaluating our faculty with. There's a misalignment, but basically that form that a faculty member has to fill out is what's telling me what the system actually is.
It seems like there's like a latent variable here that leads up to fund. So how many publications you've published and how well cited they are. It seems like the latent variable there is like, how renowned of a scientist are you? How many other scientists are talking about your work and implementing your methods? And I wonder if all of this emphasis on is because with great renown often comes great funding. Do you think that's a fair one-to-one, or am I oversimplifying it a bit?
So the more somebody cites you, the more important your work is. That's fair, but there are many different reasons why you're cited multiple times. There are certain labs that have 30 names on a particular paper, and then they're more likely to cite each other and things like that. So I think there's a lot of relationships between people that do a lot of collaborations also cite each other greatly. When I was at the National Science Foundation, somebody went and saw the list of the proposals that were submitted, and they said that one and that one, they're going to go to the top and they're going to get funding. And they just made that statement. And I was thinking, oh my God, these must be like top scientists, top ideas and all that kind of stuff. It turned out that these people used to be people that get invited a tremendous amount of times to do the reviews and panels. So they know how to tell a story. They know the review process. Oftentimes, a lot of the funding came to really good storytelling, and they just knew how to tell a story, a captivating story in a way that really resonated well with scientists. So I think that there are many different reasons why we think that more citations is important, but I just feel like there's more to be a scientist than just the number of citations.
Is the academic systemic value list very similar to the governmental funding value list? Are those two closely related?
One thing I really loved is I love this idea of a portfolio. There was a lot of things like you could only fund, say, 12% of the proposals that came, but on the board would be maybe 25% of the proposals. And so then you as a program officer got to choose with other program officers and with the input from the community, which are the projects that we're going to fund. And a lot of times that was portfolio in the sense of we don't want them all to go to research one institution. We value all of these institutions. So all of these institutions should be represented. We also value beginning researchers because this is an investment, beginning researchers, to allow them to get off the ground, to be able to be successful and to get tenure. So let's make sure that those are in there. We value a range of different scientists. Different communities love different research, and the microbiome people were always super excited by microbiome stuff. And so they would put everything on the board. So another thing was like, we can't just fund microbiome stuff. We have to think about plants, but think about mammals and all of these things. So there was a different sense of portfolio, a different sense of responsibility than probably is at a particular university, and how their value are different about how someone getting money and funding that research and things like that.
I'm really glad to hear that it's not necessarily a one-to-one between you're highly cited, here's the funding. There's a lot more nuance into how those decisions are made. When your colleague walked over and wrote, boom, boom, these three are cream of the crop, they're going to get funded. Is there a skill set that's being developed there to identify who are the great storytellers just from that quick scan?
I think she was familiar with the folks, so I don't think she had read them. She just said these guys are really good grant writers. And the interesting thing is that they're good grant writers, and some good grant writers train their students to become really good grant. Sometimes we read instructions and we don't have examples of what this proposal really looks like. It's like we're in a box. We read the instructions and we say, oh, I think I understand what that means. But we don't necessarily hit it off. And that was really an interesting concept. When you usually got a list of people that proposals that you went through the whole review process with, especially if they were younger faculty and they did not get funding, I said, call me, let's talk. Or I would go to their talk at a meeting and I would introduce myself and I'd say, let's talk. Because I think that it's not totally evident what a good proposal looks like. And we don't talk about that. In academia, they're giving you a class. You're going to teach molecular biology. You're going to teach this class. And then it's choose the book, choose your lectures, do what you want. And you don't have any training in how to be an effective communicator, how to be effective at writing assessment. It's all of these things that you have to figure out. And I just think that if you can't review proposals to understand proposals look like, try to get on panels, try to figure out what the system looks like in order to gain more of an understanding about that review process and how to write a proposal.
How do you write a grant proposal using storytelling that jumps off the page, that really welcomes people into understanding it? I think maybe the answer would relate back to what we've been talking about with good art and science. It's that it's communicating something that makes people feel maybe curiosity, maybe other feelings.
When I had a lab and I worked with students, what we would do is we would read the first sentence of papers. And then we would say, who is this story for? You know, sometimes a paper starts with licked bees in the desert of Arizona are important cactus pollinators. And then you're like, who's the audience? People work on bees, people who work on cactus and pollinate. And it's like, it's that, right? And then sometimes it would be a title like climate change has had a strong impact on the distribution, abundance, and phenology of a variety of organisms, both on land and in the sea. That's a big audience that includes a lot of people. And I think that one of the things to think about when you're writing a grant and you're thinking about telling the story is you can find grants that are like for people who work on ferments, people who work on bees, go at it. That's your audience. That you want to make sure that you value those things that they are telling you they value. But if they're broad grants, what I typically advise is write a captivating story about compelling questions in your field, but do not include your system. Just as an exercise, it's not your system. What are these questions? If you're working in molecular biology, learning about communication systems and how they affect degenerative diseases, but you work on one degenerative disease, right? That's fine. Big picture. What are the big picture things? Because a lot of people that are reviewing your proposal may not be working on bees or fern, but they get this idea of what are the big questions? And then the really good storytellers were the ones that created the big conceptual idea, the big story, the big compelling question, or the ideas of knowledge gaps that exist. And you're like reading, and then all of a sudden they say, we're going to explore these questions in bees that are found in the desert of Arizona. And then you go, oh, that's perfect. Because really your system is just the opportunity to ask really good questions. But it shouldn't be that you're trying to fund this and squeeze this system. You're asking broad questions, and your system is just a compelling way to be able to ask those big questions that you're thinking about. And I think that tends to be a really good storytelling method in grant writing.
Is it like when you're describing the system, it's like world building, if we're taking it into the storytelling analog? Like you're building out the world, but the world itself isn't the story. Like in Frozen, it wasn't about the fjord and the cold and like this Nordic country. It was about two sisters finding who they are in relation to one another and other. You could have put that story in a variety of systems, but if you just communicate it from the perspective of the system, it limits it to that world. Is that kind of what you're describing?
Yes. So it's like, what's compelling, right? So is a talking snowman compelling that lives in these places? We could describe different components and we go, I don't get it. And then if you tell the story of two sisters, they're trying to find each other, or the dynamics of people and how this system allows us to explore those things. Yeah, absolutely. Then all of a sudden we're engaged, right? We're not committed to, I don't work at fjord. It just felt like somebody wrote a story about compelling questions and idea. And then when you get to the system, you didn't even anticipate that you'd be working on mammals or plants or something like that. A lot of students, when you go, what do you do? They say, I do PCR analyses and I work on Z14, mitochondria, whatever. And I think people's just eyes just gloss over. For me, I think it's like, oh, I work on degenerative diseases and try to find ways to develop medicines to help people overcome them. And then people, how do you do that? And he goes, good, glad you asked, because the way we work on it is we look at mitochondria and this and that. Right. So what is the big picture of what you're working on? What are the compelling questions? And then the system and those details of what you do are just the way that you see it through this vision, this idea. I often find that students, when they write their CVs, they often write the things that they do, but not why, or a captivating big picture of what were the questions that you were asking in these experiences? What were the goals of these experiences? Instead, if I did this and that, the storytelling, it's hard for me to see who you are other than the tasks that you do. And so I think returning to that big story, that captivating story, is a really good way of writing effective grants.
It's so interesting. It sounds like when we ask, what do you do? And what we really want to know is why do you do what you do? So that then we can ask, how do you do that? And I'm trying to think of how I would apply it to me. Probably what I do is that I apply statistical models to do program evaluations to help researchers estimate their scientific impact beyond the lab. And sometimes that involves 3D animation and sometimes that involves data visualization. But if instead I led with, if I'm talking to anybody who asked me, what do you do? Can you name a scientist that's alive right now, this work that you're fascinated in? And I think a lot of people wouldn't be able to do that outside of other scientists. And so it would be like, that's why I do what I do. I want science to be discussed as colloquially as like the latest celebrity scandal. You should be able to pass Time Magazine and all the other magazines and be like, hey, Drone Collider, and like, here's the latest development. And and that should be there because it's fascinating. It's driving the future of our world. Like, how cool is that?
If you're in an elevator or you run into somebody and they say, what do you do? It's like, what's the big thing of what you do? What do you think is important about the thing that you do? And then let them ask questions about, so how do you do this? Because it's a compelling, again, world building where it's like, that's what you do. How do you do that? And we let them ask those questions and they go, glad you asked.
Last time we spoke, we talked about the kind of tension between these more individualistic I's versus the more collectivistic we's. And I feel like we're getting at the heart of that with listening and putting the purple before the method. Can you help me unpack a little bit more about the balance researchers can strike between their individual contribution to science versus elevating the community of science?
And I think that gets back to this idea of what are the metrics that we value? What are our values? And what are the metrics that we think are success? And what are the metrics that the system uses for success? And I think that when it came to academia, I struggled because I really love working with others. During COVID, I was just like, I can't do this. I ended up getting a job. And for 2 years, I was at home. and I was interacting with people online, and I wanted to be there with somebody, to work with somebody. When it comes to academia, we have who's the first author. If you get a grant, are you the main PI or are you secondary? And it's like this strong connection between how much you mattered in the context of creating something. And as a program officer, I would call people up and say, congratulations, you got this grant. And they may not be the lead per institution, but they're like a collaborating institution. And the people from collaborating institutions would be a little down, but they'd be, go, great. And they were like, yeah, but I still have to get a grant for my tenure. And they want to talk about that. And I'm just like, why can't this matter for your tenure? And I think that they basically had absorbed this feeling that this work didn't matter as much because it wasn't them who were driving. That's a huge struggle. And the other thing that I found really exciting working in an NSF was this idea that sometimes these proposals brought together people from different fields and they found a really good, compelling thing that moved the field forward because it was original. I'm a field ecologist and a behavioral ecologist, but I also work with physiologists and I work with people who do genetics. And I feel like we have all contributed and made a lot of those types of things. But in my own development, I was always given this pressure of you got to publish single author paper and you can't put yourself on all of these different grants if that means you can't write your own grant for this. And in a way, I think that really just stifles the idea that we have collaborations because collaborations are things that we pay for. We still have time. We still are going to publish paper, but that's going to be a time sink relative to the big benefit I can get by working on my own. And I think that can make us feel disconnected, especially if we do like collaborations. Important things to do is make these collaborations known. If you're working on a particular paper and maybe you're in a meeting and then somebody goes, yeah, you published that one paper on this. This is our team published this. And so, actually, it was her idea. And she just used my date for the, like, share that. Make it like it's a cultural thing. My lab was very much like, this is yours. This is yours. You're collaborating here. And the outcome of this collaboration will be less than something that you created in your own pile. I think that there are just many ways that we can think about metrics and how we value the contributions of others within the spaces that we inhabit so that we can change it.
I remember as an undergraduate looking at tenured professors as just like the top of humanity. It seemed so inaccessible to me. As I've matured in my career, I do very much value and appreciate tenured professors. And I also understand some of the limitations of that label and that system. And like you said, those metrics. I've got like a two-part question, but I want to give it to you one part at a time. So the first part is if you personally could redesign the academic tenure system to reflect your values, what would it measure?
I'm not sure I have the answer, but I think that it would be really great to have a list of things you can choose. So, for example, if you're really good at teaching and mentoring, how much can that be of your portfolio? And can grants and teaching compensate for your grants and research? We have a one-size-fits-all approach to faculty and how we evaluate faculty. In some systems, I remember hearing where if you mentor a lot of students in your lab, then that can count for a class. So I would just consider that there's more than one way to be a professor. A lot of departments now, science departments might have a professor that's focused on teaching and learning. And their research is about publishing journals that are more teaching oriented, but they're being accepted. And for me, I'm just thinking that they show that there are alternatives to being a professor and playing a role in society. So I guess my main thing would be, let's imagine many different ways that a professor can be successful and many different ways that assessments can help us value that. So for example, my wife, when she was in academia, she got a grant and it was like over $1 million. It was a huge collaboration with lots of different institutions. But they didn't want to count it for her and because it wasn't a research grant, even though it was funding a lot of research that actually came from that particular grant. And so for me, it was just like myopic. It was just like, what is it that you want here? And now all of a sudden a grant is a different type of grant, or I don't know. I just feel like there's more ways that we can imagine what a professor could be. And each institution is going to have a different range of what that professor can be within that institution, right? Because each institution is going to have its own audiences, its own goals, and all that kind of stuff that go along with it. But I guess what I would do is I would think about ways that we can have different types of scientists be successful within institutions. We probably know scientists that were terrible teachers, but then there were other teachers that really liked it.
Maybe we should push back on that assumption that they didn't care. What if they're like a plant and we're thinking about they just didn't, honestly, not even to be like the contrapositive, thinking about not deficit preming those professors, but they recognized that they weren't going to be rewarded for being excellent teachers. And so maybe instead of not caring, they were just focused on what they thought was going to advance their career.
Then we need to create different incentive systems to promote different things, because we do say that we value education. I've honestly never that, at least at Research One institutions, and my experience, we have a lot of metrics that are evaluating a person and their teaching, right? Oftentimes it was like, if they publish a lot and they get a lot of money, they get bad reviews, but that's okay because it turns out they're so smart that the students just don't get it and they have high standards, right? But if a person doesn't publish, doesn't get money, then all of a sudden, oh, and they're also a bad teacher.
Is you're more likely to be dismissed or not given tenure if you don't get the grants despite being an excellent teacher versus the reverse of being a terrible teacher but being exceptionally grant funded. One of those people tends to be valued more than the other.
But the way that the university sells itself a lot to the students and to the parents is that you're going to get an excellent education. And it's your kids' future that we are constructed to be able to facilitate.
So I almost wonder, maybe departments could view their professors the way that the National Science Foundation views their grants. We're in a portfolio and you value different things, different institution types, different career trajectories or duration of career. Similarly to, I wrote down 5 things that I thought each of these is important to being a good academic and can result in funding beyond just a governmental agency. Like it could be beyond that. So of course there's knowledge advancement, right? That tends to be the one where like we've got lots of government research opportunities to fund this because it's important that we advance knowledge for innovation in the government sector. I think on a cultural level, collaboration and having faculty who are uniquely gifted in facilitating and growing collaborations, I would think of that as an incredible asset to a university. Then there's communication. This is one of those ones that I feel like beyond writing papers, really just like the informal science communication part of it all. It's one of those things that I feel like a lot of people want to do this as researchers. They want to engage in formal science communication, but their bandwidth is limited to the other things that are more valued. Mentorship, being an exceptional mentor, just like being an exceptional educator. I consider both of those to be the same thing. That is, I think, extremely important to a university, particularly given that enrollment rates have been on the decline for so long. And then finally, commercialization. So do you have the capacity to envision how the research that you're doing on a fundamental level can be applied practically and connect to industry and entrepreneurship? All of these approaches can bring funding to the university, and it could be a part of your departmental portfolio that you have a chemist who's great with industry and a chemist who's an incredible educator and can help mentor the other chemists and making them better teachers overall. What do you think about that?
I think that they're all really super valuable, right? And they also get back to this idea of who are you as this professor, right? And you're not all going to value different things, but many things can make you excited. Mentorship, collaboration, publishing. I loved writing grants. So there's just many different things that can define who you are. There's more ways to be a faculty member than the limited range of ways that we evaluate them. And I think that maybe if we open that up a little bit more to recognize those values, that I do think that there has to be transparency, right? So this can be substituted for this, or choose one of these 3 categories to do, or keep it broad. And then they understand that they can take things from these different components to argue about their scholarship or whatever it is that their promotion that they're doing. I remember when they first had broader impacts, my professor was talking to other faculty and they were saying, what does this mean? And that their assumption was it just means you have to publish more and present at more meetings because that was their idea, their concept of what broader impacts and the role of a scientist is. But the new generation is super creative and have really reimagined and revalued those things as the role of what a scientist is. I understand the money, but some of the other ones just seem a little bit arbitrary and not as impactful. Is a paper in a journal that's going to get 2 citations in 10 years as valuable as a lot of outreach or training of students?
If you could restructure it based on your values, what would it be? And if we could change it for academia as a whole, what would we make it? I perceive research as being a little fragile, particularly right now. Like just in the last 6-7 months, I think we've been able to see some of the ways that our research systems can be fragile to like changes in society, changes in administration, right? I wonder if we could build a more resilient research infrastructure if we value these different types of contributions that academics are so well suited to advance, like industry connection, mentorship and teaching, also like knowledge advancement. If we honored those different parts of people and what they value as researchers and allowed them to bring in funding to the universities through a collaboration with bio and pharma or through a media channel, and also bringing in knowledge through PLOS One and the research journals that are looking to make things more open access. If we were able to diversify the way that we bring income into our universities, I think that would inherently allow the university to then value different types of skill sets. And if we did that, to me, there's a high potential that we will increase our resilience as researchers, as a systemic whole. What do you think of that?
Well, I love that idea. And I think that sometimes our academic institutions they're facing a lot of problems, funding sources, and just the structure of how they could be. DEI, all of these different things are being challenged. And I think right now it is an important time to think about what are opportunities, because the doors are collaborations with pharma, collaborations with other institutions to bring in funding. I think those are going to be essential. And so then how do you control the crisis that's happening right now to make a better system? So I love your idea because in a system that's comfortable, that gets money from NIH, that gets money from NSF, there's no need to change, right? There's no need to redefine what a researcher does. But if collaborations with pharma can be sold as here's other money sources that fund students, train students, align them to future jobs, and form different internship opportunities. Right now, I think there's a window for us to listen to those alternatives that you proposed. And I think that those alternatives are wonderful ways to reimagine a system that is very conservative and doesn't typically want to change because everything seems to be working the way necessarily needed to be working.
When pressure is applied, things tend to change. We know that as scientists, and it's no question that we're under extraordinary pressure to change. And I would say it's coming from a lot of directions. It's so easy for us, I think, at least for me, it's been easy to get trapped in the negativity of I used to have this and now I don't. But necessity is the mother of invention. And if we embrace the fact that multiple warning signs and alarms and negative impacts of us not changing are happening, what feels like all at once, but really has been happening for a long time. Maybe that'll give us the motivation that we need to go like, how can we re-envision academia so that industry collaborations are baked into an undergraduate's experience at the institution? And those collaborations between university and industry become inroads for this incredible opportunity. As an industrial innovator, having bright scientists trained, thinking about how can this be applied to serve this sector. I can't think of anything that would be more valuable than that.
I do feel like there could be a scientist that goes, I don't want to work with pharma. I just want to do basic research. And it's like, you fit, but let's make room for another way of being a scientist. And that other way might be working in collaboration with pharma just creating a new way of imagining. Because I do feel like a lot of times we value basic research, but that's often very disconnected from the applied things. So students often have to make a jump once they leave. Okay, I want to work in conservation, but I'm getting my PhD in these theories, but I'm not working with conservation organizations because there's no system that connects us. Because I do think that basic research and being able to do basic research is a little bit of privilege. What about the responsibilities we have to so many of your students who will not go into academic institutions and do basic research? They're going to industry, they're going to hospitals, they're going to all of these different places that we are not honoring in those academic spaces. I think this is a really good opportunity to control that narrative and to not just say, we can get money here, but go, oh, speak in the language of the institution, go, we can get money from pharma and at the same time train students to get into these different industries. I think this is probably a good opportunity to really be able to control that narrative, what it means to be a faculty member in this.
My hope is that we'll see a lot more of a shift between learning objectives and all of these like very dry and a little outdated approaches to what education in higher ed is. What if we brought in Pixar animators who are currently working on animating these characters that represent different elements? So there's a movie called Elemental that does this. There's one that's like fire and one that's water. And thinking like, what if we brought in a bunch of chemists and physicists who are at the undergraduate institution learning about these concepts and challenge them to work with these animators to create a scientifically accurate depiction of what it would be like for these two characters to come together.
And these are opportunities to really reimagine that in a context in which all ideas are on the table. If we were comfortable with everything, then why do we need to make these radical changes? I was often told that academia is like turning the Titanic. It takes a long time. And systems don't want to change. Academic systems don't want to change. Maybe this is an opportunity for us to reimagine those things. The one thing that gets back to something that we sort of alluded to that has been on my mind that really changed dramatically after I left academia. I agree with you that I just thought that getting tenure was this amazing thing. It was the pinnacle. It was like at the top. If you did everything right and you got tenure, that meant that you were a real scientist, that society valued you, and then you had all of this protection and you had all of these different things. And it's weird because I think we put that into the minds of all these people that we train, but we have all these institutions and most people don't have tenure or on tenure track positions. Just out of curiosity, do you know how many people in our academic institutions have or on a tenure track position? So it's about 23%. So you're right. That's how many people have tenure. And there are about 30% that are on tenure track. But then what happens to all the other academics? Are they less than scientists? Do they not deserve the protection that the other scientists do? I remember when I was at CU Boulder and there was a recession, there were a lot of teaching faculty that were just let go. They just, I'm sorry. And they were really good people that taught me a lot because I was new and I'm working. And they're like, oh, well, this is the way you do this. This is the way. And then I went to they were gracious. They really wanted to be in that classroom. They interacted with students. They did all of these things. And I really liked them. And then they were let go because guess what? They don't have tenure. In a weird way, it was like it gave us permission to just let them go because they don't have tenure. And I just found that when I was in institutions, people would say, yeah, but my vote doesn't really matter because I'm not a tenured faculty. Or they had this real sense of job insecurity because they didn't have tenure. And then I found that faculty who did not have tenure, who were pre-tenure, couldn't be as innovative. They couldn't shake things up. No faculty member without tenure said, I cannot wait to tell them what's on my mind. And I think it was an opportunity for the institution to mold somebody and to get papers and to get publications. And it just seemed like a system that benefited the people who already had a position that were tenured and the institution. It just seemed counter to a lot of the values that we had about people. I'm at an institution where I feel like I can freely speak my mind and I can talk to people and I could do all those things. I don't need that tenure to feel like I belong there. So I'm more asking than anything. I think tenure is an artificial thing. It's a constructed thing that we often attribute so much to, but I think we should question it. I'm not saying we should get rid of it. I think we should just say, what does it mean that 70% of the faculty that are at institutions don't have tenure? Are they less than? If we said tenure was the most you could be of a scientist, do they deserve less protection? And what are the benefits and costs of having tenure in the development of faculty and in equity in all of these different processes that exist that are associated with it?
I wonder sometimes if tenure is a vehicle through which academia extracts as much as possible from a human being who is in their early career and has the most energy that they'll ever have and the most motivation to give to something as they ever will. And that is there solely to just optimize the extraction process and a synthesis reaction. I almost wonder if that's what it's for, that it has nothing to do necessarily with who's the better scientist. We want that carrot because we have been in academia our whole lives. And the carrot means a lot to us. We really like it when we get good grades and we follow the rules and people say, good job. As academics as a whole, I would argue that a lot of us have that innate characteristic of wanting to please the system. And so the system found a way, like, you want to please us? Give everything you've got for these like 6 to 8 years, and then we'll think about maybe not making your job probationary. It doesn't seem right to me. I don't know. What do you think?
There was that other analogy about the fish will be the last to discover water. And that's the idea that sometimes there are certain things in our environment that we don't even know that we accept, but we accept because it's there. It's in the culture. It's in the belief. It's just the way it is. And I think that a lot of times tenure is just the way it is. And it just seems like this hope that you can't overcome, but it's just a rule that if you want to be in an academic system, this is just a rule. But I do think that it does extract from somebody and it does mold people and shape them in the way that the system wants them to be shaped. So these people are put on lots of committees and you can't turn committees down, right? Because someone's going to say whether you actually fit or don't fit in this institution based on all of these different criteria. Remember comps? Somebody described it as comps are just like we put you in a room and then we turn on the water and we want to know when that water reaches your nose and when you have to doggy paddle and when you just can't swim anymore. And I'm like, that does not sound like it doesn't sound like a way of knowing it or improving or mentoring or something like that. And I've actually known a couple of students in my own development that after their comps decided I'm not going. It just did not hit. And that's just the same thing with tenure. You give up things like we can't have a family now because we have to go to the coal mining. We have to constantly work in the system and keep the system going so that the system approves me and then I can have a family afterwards or something like that. I think sometimes we're in a world in which people take from us all sorts of things. So like an academic might feel like they're taking this away, they're taking that away. And I think tenure is often in that list of the things that they're taking from us. I can have the feeling that people know or feel that it used to mean something and that it's something that's being taken away. And here's another opportunity to say, what is it? What are the costs and benefits? And what does it mean if we don't have that anymore? Sometimes it strikes me that it's a privilege thing, that people at an institution cannot be fired and academic freedom. But they can if they do things that are wrong, like wrong and everything. So part of me thinks that it's an illusion. Part of it to me feels like it's privilege, this idea that nobody can bump you where you are and when the rest of society, you're a bad person or that business breaks, they have to make calls. I've had an interesting relationship being outside than being inside, whereas when I was inside, I would be more likely to fight for the idea of tenure. And then when I'm on the outside, I'm just like, was it really that great?
Does the concept of tenure overall still serve academia?
Yes. And I think that there are going to be some people that are vehemently, like totally opposed to my idea. And I'm just like, let's talk about it. I'm not in a tenure position. I'm intellectually wondering about deconstructing these systems and then thinking about what did we put up? How did we construct them? And are they still viable today? Like you were talking about how maybe that there's opportunities to bring in pharma. That's a whole way of reconstructing what it means to be a faculty member, what it means to be a university. We need to think about the environment we're in, and that sometimes it's the environment and the way it's constructed that is just not conducive to our own success or even to the success of the system.
We've talked about the Leadership Institute with Sagnas, and you highlighted a bit in our conversations about embracing discomfort and uncertainty. I think those are another words for curiosity in a way, but how can researchers cultivate that kind of openness to their own professional development and the way that they pursue problem solving?
I think that there is a power to be trained as a scientist. We have this efficiency because we have structure, like an approach. There's a problem. We go, oh, well, first thing, what's the question? Okay, so what are the three hypotheses or the different ways that we can explain this? How are we going to do the methods or whatever, right? So it's just like we have a structure. Part of the beauty of being a scientist is you're in control in these particular situations. But when I left academia, I was struggling. I felt like all of the things that I was doing on the side, like teaching, outreach, training, all of those things, were the things that were not valued, but they were central to my own who I was. And I didn't value all the other types of metrics. And I didn't connect. And my therapist gave me a book, and it is by Kima Chandran, and it's called When Things Fall Apart. And this idea is that when you're going through a difficult time, instead of denying that discomfort, denying that fear and all those things that come with it, embrace it. And embrace it in order to understand how you can develop a solution. Because then that way all of yourself is in that conversation. For example, I tended to just go, oh, all these things stress me out. But once I get into this tenure track position, or once I do this, they'll all go away. I didn't really focus on the fear and the discomfort that went along with it. And so after reading that book, it just really transformed me and made me just go, what is it that I'm feeling? And what does it mean? What is fear? And I felt like I really made a lot of progress myself, so my own understanding of things. And so that led me to now just constantly think about, why do I have discomfort right now? I think sometimes we actually can be in a place where somebody poses an idea and you go, I don't like that person, or I don't like that idea. And it's just like this feeling. And then all of a sudden that feeling gets rationalized as, why am I opposed to that? And I think now I'm more understanding of, I'm uncomfortable with this idea, but why am I uncomfortable with the idea? And then sometimes what that means is I need to listen and not drive where this is going. I need to ask questions. I need to do all of these things. And I think that if we embrace that as researchers and academics, I think we can benefit in many ways. For example, I think that sometimes when students get stuck in something or they're challenged by something, they can really take it personally. I don't know the answer. I can't figure this out. I can't, and they're taking it really hard. But I think as a faculty person, as a researcher, you can promote nobody knows. You're the first one to come up with this problem, and we're going to try to develop a solution for it. And I think that a lot of times we value students in the classroom that are struggling, and we say, oh, this is great, they're going to struggle. And as a student, it doesn't feel good to go, I don't know the answer. But we love the idea that they're struggling to get to an answer or a solution. But we are uncomfortable. We have to go through that particular struggle to figure out something that we don't know about. And I think that just being able to acknowledge that not knowing and discomfort and not understanding is absolutely a part of the process. And we have to go through that. And then once we find that solution, that's when we get our dopamine high. And that's where we tend to lie. But that discomfort, we make it go away. We don't acknowledge it as a part of the whole process. So I would just say that just realize that the discomfort is because of something. It requires a solution. But in order to us to get a solution, we really need to let ourselves go and ask ourselves why it's discomfort, whether it's professionally, personally, or on a research base. It's a beautiful part of the process that gets to the eureka, but we need to go that process.
So often I think when I've encountered discomfort in me, I have thought it was because they were wrong and I was right. I think it's a really good chance to start embracing the idea that when you feel uncomfortable about something, it might just be that you don't understand it very well. And of course, we're like separating discomfort, like clearly toxic, abusive situations. Let's put that over here and just talk about everything else. I have a lot of colleagues and friends who are trans, and them asking for pronouns to be used for them can sometimes make our other colleagues uncomfortable. That discomfort, is it coming from what you are applying as your value system to someone else? Or is it coming from somebody communicating a need that you're not ready to give? And what questions do you need to ask to figure out what this is really about? And maybe when we feel uncomfortable is when we should ask the most questions.
There's an interesting idea that we are not rational creatures that also feel. We're emotional creatures that also reason. And that's true. And I think that because we're scientists, we often think, no, we're totally rational. And we see it in reverse. And we often feel like that idea is making me feel bad. And I have to make an argument against it. But oftentimes we may have a feeling about somebody or something that somebody's saying, and then we use all of this reason to back up why we're feeling that way. And we can go down a rabbit hole that's not very conducive, but it addressed the feelings that we got, the discomfort that we got. It gave us the sense of control. Somebody had mentioned that there's a golden rule that do unto others as you would do unto you. And they were saying, no, it's supposed to be do unto others as they were done unto them. And I was just like, okay, that was a different construct. But thinking about your trans friends in that space, we have a discomfort, but we have to shift and say, what's important to them relative to what's important to me and my value systems and my own expectations.
I could see somebody taking that message and kind of making it extreme. What if someone tells you they really want you to slap them every time you spell them? So obviously it needs to fit in within the limits of what you're willing to do, because ultimately you are the decider of what you're willing to do. But I love the idea of considering, what does it cost you versus what does it cost them? Does it mean a lot to them to be regarded in the way that they're asked, with the title that they ask? And how much does it cost you to do that? If it costs you little, and it benefits them greatly, why not?
Yeah. But I also feel like they may feel discomfort in that situation, but they don't think about that discomfort. Why am I feeling uncomfortable with this ask? And what does that have to do with me? Like, why? And I do feel like discomfort is, and just leaning into those times where there's no solutions and things like that. They're just as important as the solution. They're what define the problem and define what we need to get a solution. And they are necessary for that yearning or that understanding or that empathy, whatever it is, comes at the other side.
This part of our conversation reminds me of where we started, where it's like pursuing things as a scientist versus as a storyteller. And the scientist very much wants to be like, these are the objectives, and this is how we will achieve it. And these are the variables, and it's very objective. Whereas the storyteller is a lot more of, this is what will move you. This is what will make you care about this story. These characters in the world will help you understand it, because you'll be able to live through it through this lens and then apply it to your own. Exploring things from the perspective of, we are objective, rational creatures with emotions versus we are emotional creatures who think too much. What we think is obvious. And sometimes we don't know that we can be that fish who doesn't know they're swimming in water.
We have an electrician and he's fixed all of these different things. And I love the way his mind works. He comes in and then he goes, okay, there's a line that goes here. You probably have one that goes there. And he's basically using this idea of like their experience at being at different homes, the way that things are structured, and he solves problems really effectively. And I'm just impressed, and I'll ask questions and everything. I can't think like that. And the plumber comes and fixes things and they have their own method of doing whatever they're doing. And I love to ask questions and we do all that. And I do think that we have different things different places that we work, and there are different types of modes of thinking, modes of communicating, all of those things that we develop within all of our different communities. And so a filmmaker or someone who is doing graphic design or doing all sorts of things, they have their own language. They have their own understanding of what works, what are all these things. And I think it's those creations between each other that are the opportunities to learn how to communicate in different types of environments. And sometimes those environments align together, right? We do get used to different modes of thinking, different people to communicate with, and different values. I love all of the different voices. I love all the different perspectives and the different ways of communicating. And we just have to be thoughtful of how to learn to be an effective communicator from different perspectives in a humble way.
Our last guest was Colleen Kelly. And Colleen is this incredible science communicator who has taught at the university level. And now, after her retirement, has decided to teach pre-K up to fourth grade, but teaching molecular literacy and chemistry to these young groups of people. And one thing she firmly believes in is that as soon as we learn the English alphabet, we should start learning the chemistry alphabet. This is important to her on many levels. I showed her the video that you shared with me about axolotls. She said that her students go nuts for axolotls. They want to relate everything to them. Almost any concept she will present, she will go, how does this affect the axolotl? I guess that speaks to the importance of a character that you can relate to. Since chemistry is so abstract, maybe that's why it's adorable and it has frills and it's easy to feel for an axolotl. Her question for you, though, was how do you bring the scientific method and scientific inquiry into a descriptive format? How do you capture your audience with a mystery or a question or intrigue? And how do you make your science juicier with the art?
I think that one of the important things that we try to do at work is we try to figure out a phenomenon. So what is a driving phenomenon to begin with? So for example, we're making a film right now on addiction. And we've made films on sickle cell and things like that. And I think that you have to have a phenomena that drives people to be interested in it, like students to be interested in. What do you know about addiction? It's a topic that students want to know more about. And so then with the phenomena, I think then you have to turn it over to the students and then have them generate questions. Like, what questions did you have about this? And then let them do the driving of this. There's an approach that sort of expresses this. It goes a little bit further, and that's the idea of an anchoring phenomena. So maybe you have a phenomena like addiction, and you start with a film about addiction, and then you go, well, what do you guys think? Write some questions, and we're going to share questions, and then we're going to go put them on this board. And then you organize them. Oh, these were all about genetics, right? Or causes of addiction, genetics, environment. And then people hear like, what's happening in the brain? Okay, so this is molecular. Well, what's happening in chemistry? You separate those out. And then you go, great. So tomorrow we're going to talk about chemistry. And so in a way, you anticipate what questions the students are going to ask, what they're going to be curious about. You help drive those. And then the investigations and the other parts that come are really based on that inquiry or the interest that they themselves drove because they want to answer their own questions and not answering my questions. So I would say that an effective way is presenting a compelling phenomena, let them drive the inquiry, and then develop the activities so that they can find the answers to the questions that they're posing.
By phenomenon, I'm assuming there's an implication that there's a visual element to this. This is something that you can see, something you can experience with your senses. Is that right?
Yeah, or a story, or it could be a picture, or it could be you have a story that you hear on a radio story, or it could be a comic. It could be whatever that sort of puts into context a phenomena that you then say, so what questions do you have about this? I had a chemistry teacher, and this gets back to this chemistry, and they would start with a story. And they would say, there were all these wars that were fought over sugar. Oh, and then there would be like this historical thing about different countries and the movement of sugar around the planet. And then they would say, what is a sugar? And then the rest of it was like, yeah, well, what is a sugar? And I remember the other example was about the Nobel Peace Prize. One of the first ones was, or maybe the person who created it, but it was because nitroglycerin just exploded. It just was too volatile. All of these people were dying. And then somebody came up with the idea of dynamite. And dynamite was able to save a lot of lives and still be able to be used. And then he said, all dynamite is chemical bonds that are breaking and releasing energy. What's a chemical bond? And by the time you get to what's a chemical bond? So I think that an important phenomenon that leads you to ask a question that you want answered is a way of getting students to those things.
I do have two potential groups of people that we might be interviewing. So maybe I'll let you choose from them and leave a question, or you can leave a question broadly. We're thinking of bringing in researchers who, for lack of a better phrase, mastered out. And the whole purpose of that conversation is to explore. It tends to be perceived as a failure to master out, but sometimes that is the best choice for your career. When is that? And exploring that notion. And then the other group is research scientists who have filed some sort of provisional patent application and to share their moment of discovery with us. Like, when did you realize that this could be something that you could patent and commercialize?
I'm intrigued by the first group. I would ask, what was the most important thing you had to unlearn in order to be able to leave?
What was the most important thing you had to unlearn to leave your tenure granting institution?
I think the most important thing I had to unlearn is that the values that I was living towards were the values given to me. They were not my values. So I had to unlearn those things about getting tenure, having a research lab and everything were not actually what made me happy. They were given to me. So I had to unlearn them and then just replace them with what are the things that I actually value. What I actually value is my family, travel, all of these things that they were me, my community, all of those different things. It's me. That's genuinely me. I had to just unlearn that those things I thought were valued. And that was what my therapist asked me. They said, what are the things that you value? And then I gave all these academic things and they're like, that doesn't sound like yours. And I was like, oh God, they're not mine. So I guess that's what I had to unlearn.
Cesar, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.